It's an honor for me to introduce to you the first speaker of this week and this morning, who is Dr. Amos Yong. Amos is G. Rodman Williams Professor of Theology at the Divinity School of Regent University at Virginia Bay. And for the last 2 years, he also has served that school as a dean. Dr. Yong received his PhD in religion and theology from Boston University. He is a former president of the Society for Pentecostal Studies, and his academic interests are wide-ranging and include such divergent topics as Pentecostal theology, theology and science, Christian-Buddhist dialogue, political theology, and last but not least, theology and disability, which is the topic that he's probably best known for here in this audience. Among his many books in which he seeks to combine these interests are Theology in Down Syndrome, Reimagining Disability in Late Modernity, and The Bible, Disability and the Church, A New Vision of the People of God. Amos is also co-director of a new monograph series that hopefully will make an important contribution to the field called Studies in Religion, Theology and Disability, which is done by Baylor University Press here. Amos is a minister in the Assemblies of God. He and his wife Alma have 3 children and reside in Chesapeake and are members of New Life Providence Church in Virginia Bay, Chesapeake area. But as we recently learned, it will not be for long because only recently it was announced that Amos has accepted a chair at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. Today he will speak about disability and suffering, pastoral and practical theological considerations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Amos Yong.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be here. And again, thank you, Hans and Bill and others for this opportunity. When I found out that this was going to be hosted here at SMU and at Perkins, I envisioned giving this talk in a lecture hall, so I prepared a lecture. And here we are at a church, but this is what you got. At about the same time as the invitation came to be a part of this, I received an invitation also to contribute an article to a journal on disability and suffering, pastoral responses. So I've entitled this talk, Disability and Suffering with a question mark, Pastoral and Practical Theological Considerations. So here's an overview of where we're going in the next few minutes. Suffering is a difficult topic at the crossroads of disability studies and pastoral care. On the one hand, people with disabilities want to clearly distinguish impairments from the sense of suffering, urging that the former is not necessarily followed by the latter. This is in part a reaction to historically paternalistic attitudes manifest in and through pastoral care directed to people with disabilities. This paper focuses on how to empower appropriately discerning pastoral praxis so that church ministry or faith-based ministry occurs with people with disabilities and their families and caregivers rather than only to them. Such an approach unfolds in solidarity with the genuine suffering of people with disabilities rather than perpetuates the kind of social stigmatization that causes existential and psychological pain even for those who may not suffer otherwise physically. So that's sort of an overview of where we're heading. Introduction. Disability and suffering are often assumed to be interconnected. This essay seeks to problematize the connections, albeit not just theoretically or theologically, but in order to empower more appropriate religious and especially Christian praxis. So the 4 parts of this paper that follows, number 1, clarify why an uncritical equation of the two is problematic, especially in light of contemporary disability rights and disability studies perspectives. Part 2, explores how suffering follows disability, although not always as presupposed by those who are temporarily able-bodied. I'm going to use that nomenclature, TAB, temporarily able-bodied, to reference those who currently do not have disabilities or experience as much dependence on others. Part 3, sketch a pastoral theology of disability in dialogue with disability perspectives that minimizes the explicitly theological warrants for connecting suffering and disability. And Part 4, propose a dual model of disability ministry and praxis in the face of real and perceived suffering. So the goal is to complicate what Carrie Wynn and I call the normate assumptions linking disability and suffering in order to attend more appropriately both in theory and praxis to such matters in ecclesial and other faith communal contexts. And by normate, Carrie Wynn defines normate as the socially constructed ideal image through which a definitive humanity is envisaged and the approximation to which confers authority and power. It is the unquestioned glasses that temporarily able-bodied people use to see, evaluate, and engage the world, resulting oftentimes in negative perceptions of and actions impacting on people with disabilities. Before moving on, it is important to briefly define key terms and situate these reflections autobiographically. Disability, as understood in the existing scholarly literature, is not an obvious notion. It is standard within the field to distinguish impairment from disability, with the former pertaining to limitation or lack of certain physical, intellectual, or sensory capacities, and the latter, disability, involving the social, economic, and other disadvantages experienced as a result. A person could be profoundly deaf or severely hearing impaired, for instance, but if she could afford a cochlear implant or worked at her home computer as a manuscript editor, then she would not be considered as having a hearing disability. Yet the line between impairment and disability is not hard and fast. Those who are chronically ill, for another example, may, because of their condition, perform suboptimally as an employee, but not be able to document their condition to qualify for disability status. So the point is that there is both a personal and biological aspect to impairment, even as there's a social dimension of understanding how such impinges on human interactions in the broader context of public life. So that complicates a little bit this notion of impairment and disability, how we'll be using both notions today. Further caveat is the more important admission that I approach this topic not from first-hand experience of suffering disability. And so when I use the language of suffering disability this morning, part of what I'm going to try to explain is that this is both a perceived as well as a real issue. Not often, sometimes people who have disabilities do suffer, but oftentimes it's that they are perceived to be suffering. So again, when I use the word suffering disability, I'm including both notions in what I'm referring to. So to be sure, the scare quotes around this phrase, suffering disability, should itself signal that there is more to disability and impairment than what suffering is assumed to be, precisely what this essay is designed to elaborate. Nevertheless, I myself do not have an impairment, my 2400 vision notwithstanding, alleviated by my corrective lenses for sure. So in that sense, I do not have the same right as a person with disability to speak to the topic at hand. The extent of my experience of disability is having grown up with and cared for a younger brother with Down syndrome. This has led me to reflect extensively on disability, especially from a religious and theological perspective, my training in religious and theological studies. So the following does not pretend to be the final word at the intersection where disability meets suffering. It is intended merely to be a catalyst for discussion and perhaps prompt an attitudinal, behavioral, and practical adjustment, especially as that pertains to those ministering not only to but with people with disabilities for the cause of the Christian gospel. So, part 1. Why suffering is a bad word in disability rights and disability study circles. For the temporarily able-bodied, that disability and suffering are intertwined seems obvious. These associations are no doubt even stronger within religious, especially Christian contexts. After all, there's a long history of Christian care for people with disabilities stretching back through the medieval hospitals to the rise of monastic movements over 1,500 years ago, which identified the vulnerable on the margins of society and sought to provide for their needs. Many of those who were found in such hospice and hospital environments could not care for themselves and were stigmatized if not discriminated against by society. In more recent times, people with disabilities have been publicly portrayed through a variety of public media, freak show, and other venues in negative terms, as abnormal, even inhuman, objects of the temporarily able-bodied gaze. even with regard to so-called invisible disabilities, impairments of the brain or of the mind, including those related to learning disabilities, which are not obviously perceived. What is experienced of or known about them leaves temporarily able-bodied folks anxious, even fearful. Set in historical perspective, then, it may seem at least understandable why disability is generally believed to be causally related to suffering. Temporarily able-bodied obviously do not want to be dependent on the care of others, to be made a spectacle before others, or to be subject to awkward behaviors that are socially inexplicable or unacceptable. The problem, of course, is that temporarily able-bodied presuppositions are shaped by their normant anxieties and biases, and these have been relativized, if not challenged, by disability vantage points. The disability rights movement of the last generation has opened up public space for the registration of disability voices and experiences that have questioned temporarily able-bodied assumptions, and the recent emergence of disability studies as a scholarly field of inquiry is propelled by the epistemological, methodological, and theoretical lenses generated by such perspectives. From this horizon, disability theorists have sought to uncouple the fact of human impairment and the sense of suffering. So at least three major problems have been identified with how the temporarily able-bodied link the two. First, whatever the existential sense of suffering experienced by people with disabilities, temporarily able-bodied perceptions of those with impairments often results in stereotypical and prejudicial attitudes. While perhaps little can be done about personal prejudice, the normant position of temporarily able-bodied persons in society means that they have the political and especially economic power over those with disabilities, and often exercise the latter in discriminatory ways, for instance, in employment contexts. So if normant conventions regarding impairment might be innocuous enough at the attitudinal level, they're downright harmful because personal stigmatization is reinforced by what they can and cannot do, and these often lead to exclusion of people with disabilities from employment opportunities and the public sphere. While the temporarily able-bodied may be sentimental about the presumed suffering of people with disabilities, there are real socioeconomic and other structural inequalities that constrain the latter quality of life and intensify whatever other experience of suffering may already be felt. The second problem with temporarily able-bodied suppositions is that their attitudes toward those perceived as suffering are not actually harmless. Instead, the goodwill intended by temporarily able-bodied people in response motivates a kind of paternalism that can often be dangerous. For instance, the movement to sterilize women with intellectual disabilities in the first half of the 20th century is an extreme but important example. No doubt some were genuinely concerned about the welfare of their friends or loved ones who were susceptible to getting pregnant, but without the capacity to adequately raise their children. However, the state, with public backing, acted on this front in ways that violated the dignity and humanity of these most helpless. To be sure, temporarily able-bodied paternalism often manifests itself not in such violent ways, but is urged as a means to achieve other moral and social goods. But this raises another problem with how the temporarily able-bodied construe suffering in relationship to disability, that people with disabilities are treated as passive recipients dependent on temporarily able-bodied charity and sympathy rather than as having their own agency. The third concern is understandably, and again, this is a third concern of disability rights perspectives with regard to this connection between disability and suffering. The third concern is understandably related to the very definition of disability, which connotes some kind of inability or incapacity. Here, the proper human response, temporarily able-bodied or otherwise, is to help, to assist with whatever cannot be done. Now, all this is well and good, except when the person is reduced to what he or she lacks. Normant discussion thus often does not think twice about talking about the blind, the lame, and the deaf as if that were the only important or essential feature about such individuals. If the people-first language of people with disabilities is designed to respond to such reductionist categorizations by foregrounding the full humanity of those not temporarily able-bodied, that still is insufficient to overthrow the normant postulation that such individuals lack capacity or agency and are helplessly reliant on the charitable benevolence of others. The point is not to undermine the motivation for acts of kindness and generosity, but to sever the temporarily able-bodied inference that those presumed suffering with disabilities survive merely or only as passive recipients of the aid of others. All right, that was why suffering is a bad word to disability rights and disability studies circles. Section 2, why suffering is a problem for people with disabilities. Almost 3 decades ago, a younger Stanley Hauerwas, who I understand is going to be here in a few days, maybe not as young looking as he was back 3 decades ago. Almost 3 decades ago, Stanley Hauerwas put the question about suffering in relationship, especially to intellectual disability, squarely on the table. To begin, while suffering might include the experience of pain, it ought not to be assumed that all suffering involves pain. Here I'm describing Hauerwas's work in this area. In fact, some forms of suffering experienced by people with disabilities are devoid of physical pain and have to do instead with a sense of loneliness, of alienation, and of isolation from others. Further, while the root meaning of suffering involves being forced to submit to a set of circumstances, human sufferers are not merely passive endurers, but also embrace their lot in a more active sense. With regard specifically to those with intellectual disabilities, however, now in those days, remember that the acceptable nomenclature was the mentally handicapped, which is in the title of Hauerwas's book on suffering the handicapped. So he pressed the point, should all suffering be avoided? Remember, this was at a time in the 1980s in which biomedical technology was increasingly able to identify fetuses with Down syndrome and other congenital impairments, and the option was emerging about whether women or couples wanted to carry their children through to term or prevent their birth, as well as their anticipated life of suffering. Hauerwas's counter, however, was that the suffering of the mentally handicapped was less the issue than that of their mothers or parents, especially the stigma of bearing such babies and then the inconveniences of raising these less than normally developing children in an individualistic society that emphasizes independence and self-sufficiency. So his response was that within the broader framework of Christian faith, the problem is not the suffering of people or infants or children with intellectual disabilities or even that of their families, but the lack of a sufficiently rich understanding of the church as an open-hearted community that is capable of being hospitable and welcoming of such families so that these children are valued and embraced as they are. Still, there is no doubt that with regard to the severely or profoundly disabled, there is some suffering, even pain involved, just as there is no denying that parents of such infants and children, even those who are only more moderately disabled, are faced with often inconceivable challenges related to their care and provision. Further, it's also clear that those with severely debilitating diseases and injuries, including people stricken with chronic pain and chronic illness, not to mention severe mental impairment and profound intellectual disability, suffer at different levels of intensity. Last but not least, the experience of later onset disability is particularly challenging, since it requires developing or older adults not only to adjust to new bodily or sensory incapacities, but also to reorient themselves psychologically and existentially toward a new self-identity. In all of these ways and more, it is downright unjust to minimize or overlook the suffering experienced or felt. While not dismissing the suffering that attends to some, if not many, experiences of disability, I want to challenge the biomedical paradigm within which such suffering is often defined. Following Hauerwas's lead, but extending it variously, what I will argue is that suffering is often individualized according to a biomedical diagnosis. So an infant is presumed to suffer because of being born with Down syndrome. A toddler is thought to suffer because of his polio. The hearing impaired are believed to suffer because of their being hard of hearing. The visually impaired are assumed to suffer because they have to get around using canes or guide dogs. The paraplegic must obviously suffer because she has to use a wheelchair, and so on and so forth. In each case, the suffering follows from the biomedical impairment, and society, those temporarily able-bodied, is mobilized to develop technological and other interventions in order to alleviate the related incapacities and the attendant suffering conditions. But what if the social model of disability were applied to understanding suffering instead? Now again, without ignoring the biomedical aspects of impairment, the social model emphasizes that disability is as much, if not more, on some occasions, a social construction and process of socialization that defines and responds to impairing conditions according to cultural conventions, that imprisons those with impairments within economic constraints, that limits opportunities according to certain socio-political structures, and it confines some people within architectural or geographic environments. So applied to the notion of suffering, the social model insists that human suffering unfolds socially, often according to interpersonal, relational, and wider cultural dynamics. In this framework, people with disabilities suffer less because of their physical, intellectual, or sensory limitations than because they're unable to live up to normate expectations regarding living independently, achieving life quality, attaining vocational goals, and manifesting economic success. On the flip side, the temporarily able-bodied make assumptions about those who are different, impose labels on them, and implement social, medical, and other policies undergirded by normate values that constrain rather than enable the flourishing of people with disabilities. Note then that the sense of suffering has as much to do with the self-perception of failing to live up to the values and expectations of others. More to the point, the suffering of people with disabilities in these instances has to do with an internalized sense of failure. Some people with disabilities thus define themselves according to such expectations and self-identify in negative terms as those not able to do or disabled from doing this or that. The social model helps us to understand why society's treatment of individuals leads them to view themselves as others see them. They are disabled or incapable of this or incapacitated with regard to that, and come to see themselves therefore as helpless in this or that regard, unable and dependent, perhaps more in their own minds than in reality, on others. Some people with disabilities come to pity themselves, given the sympathy bestowed upon them by a normate world, while others lose their dignity as human beings through being treated paternalistically as less than by the temporarily able-bodied. How do people with disabilities retain their sense of self-esteem when the normate world devalues their existence? Religiously and theologically, people with disabilities also suffer because of how their condition is understood and what is expected of them by their community of faith. Not only do they have to contend with questions, sometimes not actually asked but certainly thought, like, why did this happen to you? As if some sin or demonic ideology could explain the presence of impairment. But they also begin to believe that their lack of faith, for instance, is one, if not a primary contributing factor to their persisting condition. Even if not embracing such a self-understanding, they then have to feel that they have to bear the burden of exemplifying the Christ-like character, particularly within Christian communities, expected of those on the path of sanctification. So that means not complaining about their situation or needing to project an overcomer's mentality in the community of faith. And if at all successful in this regard, people with disabilities become icons, even sacraments of divine virtue, patience, and fortitude in the eyes of the temporarily able-bodied faithful. And this results, again, in another set of standards or expectations foisted upon them. After all, if St. Paul said that, according to the NRSV, if God is faithful, he will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but with the testing he will provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it, if that is accepted. And if you are impaired, then obviously you must have been given a special grace to endure such disability. All right, so that's some reflections in part 2 on why suffering is a problem for people with disabilities. Part 3. Here I want to turn to what I call the 4 fences of a pastoral theology of suffering disability. This section begins to develop a pastoral approach to the experience of suffering disability by focusing on theological reorientation. In previous work, I had initiated reflection related to such a task by retrieving and reappropriating the Chalcedonian theological method. I had argued that just as the early church fathers protected the mystery of the incarnation utilizing apophatic or negative language about how not to talk about the nature of Christ. So for instance, Christ's divine and human natures were merely asserted to be without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, known also as the 4 fences of the Chalcedonian Confession. So just as the early church fathers had resorted to this apophatic language, rather than deploying cataphatic or positive descriptions of the Christological reality, so also Christians, particularly Christians, are better advised to recognize what is not known about disabilities in the context of pastoral care, rather than make presumptive affirmations about what is theologically ambiguous at best. Hence, I suggested previously that these four offenses of the mystery of Christ could translate into four offenses regarding disability in relationship to divine providence. That God's will is not arbitrary, that divine providence and creaturely responsibility are not mutually exclusive, that human willing is not opposed to the laws of nature, and that proper pastoral care should never presume to provide any definitive theological explanations for disability. The point is that a more humble approach is needed, one that acknowledges there is much that is not understood theologically, even as trust and faith in God ought to be nurtured. So I developed that in a section of my book, Theology and Down Syndrome. Now, building on this platform, let me suggest four offenses toward a theology of disability in the context of pastoral care for people and their families suffering disability. First, God's sovereignty does not mean that God is the direct cause of disability in any specific sense. Yes, Scripture periodically suggests that God is the cause of impairments, including, as when Yahweh rhetorically pressed Moses, quote, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is not I the Lord?" Unquote. However, there are many instances of those with sickness or impairment across the Scriptures which etiology is not linked to God's sovereign will. Mephibosheth was crippled in his feet because of an accident, and Trophimus was simply said to have been left ill in Miletus, just to mention one instance from each testament. My point is simply that we can never know any specific disability as having been directly willed by God, and therefore should not tell people with disabilities that their suffering, if such is experience, is divinely sanctioned. Divine sovereignty does not need to translate into a view that every specific event in the cosmos is part of God's particular intention. Second, that we live in a sinful and fallen world does not mean that human sins are directly linked to disability in any case. Yes, there might be obvious occasions when creaturely choices bring about impairing consequences. Yet even here, the appropriate pastoral response does not just make that point and leave things at that. Sensitivity to the scriptural connections between sin and disability in general should alert pastoral caregivers to the reality that many believers continue asking, as did the disciples encountering the visually impaired man, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus' response is crucial for present purposes. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We'll return in a moment to the latter clause of Jesus' reply, but for now what needs to be emphasized in the context of pastoral care, especially when interacting with those who are suffering, is that disability and sin are related only in a general sense, in the general sense that we live in a fallen world, and not necessarily in any individual case. If people come to realize through introspection that their experience of suffering disability can be gleaned from in order to make life adjustments and better choices, then pastoral agents can help them to process these thoughts. But proper pastoral care should not begin by tying the experience of suffering disability too tightly with sin. It is not only presumptive but judgmental from a normative point of view. Third, so the first offense had to do with divine sovereignty. The second sense had to do with uncoupling sin and suffering disability. Third, there are some scriptural passages that suggest sickness and impairments derived from the work of Satan and his demons. But these do not mean that disability is so derivative in any particular case. Even if Job was tormented by the accuser, and even if Jesus' response to the deaf mute was to exorcise an evil spirit, that neither justifies the devil behind every particular impairment notion, nor warrants the assumption that epilepsy is of demonic provenance. This is not to say that the human experience of impairment is devoid of a spiritual dimension. There's no doubt, for instance, that the biblical principalities and powers are intertwined with the structural evils that plague the political, social, and economic domains of human life and relationship, and in that sense are entangled also with the disabilities caused by war and famine and poverty. Yet this general cosmological perspective does not validate pastoral approaches that see satanic attack as the root cause of suffering disability. Amidst grappling with the challenges of life, people with disabilities and their families ought not to have to bear the additional burden that they're under spiritual assault from dark and destructive cosmic forces. Although such an approach is limited by and large to Pentecostal and charismatic communities, yet the explosive growth of this kind of Christianity worldwide indicates that unless specifically countered, this can become the dominant popular understanding of impairment and disability. and of suffering disability. My last fence, if pastoral agents should not resort to sovereignty, sin, or Satan first and foremost when caring for those suffering disability. I've got those 4 S's, right? You got that? Sovereignty, sin, Satan, and suffering. So also should it not be presumed that disability is meant for the sanctification of the afflicted. The point is not to deny that people with disabilities as well as their caregivers are in need of sanctification. All people, especially Christian believers, can use an added dose of divine holiness in their lives. However, popular piety sometimes thinks that there must be a rationale for the existence of impairment or disability. And if the blame cannot be put on God, sin, or the devil, then it must serve some providential purposes related to the individual's spiritual journey. Perhaps the sanctification of this person's life will also be exemplary for others, or enable solidarity among those so suffering. All that is well and good, but the point to be emphasized is that even if these are conclusions those suffering disability might well come to on their own, they should not be presumed by temporarily able-bodied pastors and counselors. So this same caveat of allowing people with disabilities to come to their own informed perspective applies for the other 3 fences. Those suffering disability can, through earnest wrestling with the Scriptures, among other resources, come to embrace their experience as somehow providentially ordained, come to the conviction that they are somehow under some kind of spiritual onslaught, or take these as prompts to re-examine their personal, moral, and spiritual lives. My argument is not that pastoral agents cannot be in conversation about such matters with those suffering disability. Rather, I insist that such explanations not be where the discussion begins, imposed on people with disabilities by the temporarily able-bodied. All right. Bringing it home here, part 4, suffering disability, redemptive pastoral praxis. How then to proceed after this theological reorientation? In this final section, I emphasize a pastoral praxis that focuses on redeeming the suffering of disability, that ministers to those suffering disability, and that engages in ministry with people with disabilities. Each is interrelated with the others, supporting a holistic pastoral approach. What does it mean to talk about the redemptibility of disability, including the suffering of disability? Again, temporarily able-bodied pastoral agents should approach such matters cautiously. However, to take off from the preceding discussion about the 4 fences of suffering disability, the main emphasis ought to lie on the fact that while God should not be thought of as sovereignly ordaining or imposing such suffering, whatever the cause of harm, pain, or tragedy, God can bring about something good, something restorative. As Jesus indicated in response to the disciples' query about whether the man's blindness resulted from his own sin or that of his parents, there's nothing to be gained by attempting to decide what caused the blindness. Instead, our focus should be redemptive, following God's overarching intentions, that God's works might be revealed in him. That's what Jesus' response was. The goal is therefore a reorientation from causality or etiology toward redemption or eschatology. Impairments come about variously. Congenitally through genetic mutations, for instance, incidentally through a fall, a car crash, as a byproduct or causality of the human conditions, through wars or natural disasters. So impairments and disabilities can come about through all of these different means, if you will. But salvation is God's business. So particularly for Christian pastoral caregivers and for Christian theologians, while we will never be able to provide a fully rational theodicy for those suffering disability, yet Christian eschatology can outline the basis for human hope amidst the despair of disability. So my suggestion is to focus on the cosmological conditions when talking about causality, but to shift to the theological horizon or theological hope or eschatology when attempting to nurture and inspire human endurance. Practically, such an accent on the redemptibility of disability and whatever suffering comes in its trail should also provoke ministry to and with people with disabilities. Ministry to such people and their families should, of course, not be conducted condescendingly or as if out of duty. People with disabilities and those who care for them are in the best position to identify what their needs are and how best the church or others might be able to assist. The temporarily able-bodied must never presume the form that ministry to those suffering disability should take. Instead, Life-giving ministry emerges from out of a discerning mutuality between ministers and others. The model here would be, at least in part, the L'Arche community, where core members, people with disabilities, and their attendants relate to one another as equals, but yet also as different. Even if core members are unable to verbally communicate their needs, attendants take time to carefully learn about and then discern how appropriate caregiving should unfold. Two aspects are therefore worthy of highlighting. First, those who most suffer disability would welcome ministry. However, such ought to be available in a discerning manner. Second, effective ministry to those suffering disability emerges from out of genuine human relationship, even friendship. In other words, authentic ministry to people with disabilities opens up when ministers take the time to get to know and even befriend people with disabilities and their families and caregivers, less out of professional motivation than out of Christian selflessness. Now, out of sustained religious and particularly Christian friendship and relationship, ministry to people with disabilities opens up to ministry with them. More precisely, the us of those temporarily able-bodied and the them of those suffering disability itself will be overcome. The divide between the two. Not that the differences will be erased, since that itself would not recognize or affirm the bodily form of disability as also uniquely in the image of God. Rather, the point is that the ministry of the body of Christ includes each member in his or her particularity, vulnerability, and even weakness, bearing the gifts of the Holy Spirit. To talk about disability in terms of vulnerability and weakness risks perpetuating able-bodied and normate assumptions that those living with impairments are less strong. However, that is precisely the apostolic counter to the Corinthian presupposition about their own nobility, capacity, and intelligence, which included insistence that the ways of divinity involved the mobilization and utilization not of the self-assured, but of those who recognize their limitations as creatures made in the image of God. So the point here again is twofold. First, that people with disabilities, no matter how severe or even profound, ought not to be viewed merely as passive objects of ministry, but can also be welcomed as agents of ministry, even if in some circumstances how such ministry is carried out will require patience, creativity, innovation, and persistence. Second, in building from the first, it is precisely as ministers to others that those suffering disability realize they are being created in the image of God with the capacity to participate in the mission of God, and this itself is redemptive, not only for people with disabilities, but for those whom they minister to. Concluding thoughts. This essay is intended to accomplish four related purposes. First, to interrogate the normate assumption that all disability brings about suffering. Second, to clarify how the suffering of disability oftentimes derive from norming expectations related to and temporarily able-bodied treatments of people with disability. Third, to redirect questions about theodicy regarding suffering disability away from theological causality toward redemptive praxis. And fourth, to enable and empower those suffering disability to receive ministry from and be agents of ministry to others. The foregoing four sections have attempted to respond to these objectives. As one who is temporarily able-bodied, I urge others like me to reconsider how their attitudes and approaches to disability not only might be a cause of, but also unintentionally perpetuate the suffering that people with disabilities undergo. Awareness of this normate prejudice will take us some way toward alleviating suffering in the world, especially the suffering endured by people with disabilities. Thank you. What do I do?
Thank you, Amos. There is quite some time left for questions. So the floor is open. And masters, please stand. Oh, there will be a microphone brought to you. And would you introduce yourself to all of us?
I'm Ann Masters, the Director for Pastoral Ministry with Persons with Disabilities for the Archdiocese of Newark, New Jersey, the Catholic Church. And you hit on 2 points in particular, Amos, that are sort of an ongoing challenge for me in the ministry, working with parishes on structures of support to basically affirm the baptism of people with disabilities in Catholic language. And there are some incredibly well-intentioned people with generous hearts who you will often refer to the child with cerebral palsy, or the man with Down syndrome, or the woman with some form of mental illness as the face of Christ. He is the face of Christ, as opposed to the person that's usually next to them in the pew or across from the table. And then the other one is that you hit on too, is linking the disability to the cross. That your Down syndrome is just tied to the cross of Christ, and that to be for your salvation and the benefit of us all. It's really hard to pastorally respond with those people, or working with them. Any thoughts you might have would be appreciated.
I guess this is what this whole week is for, right?
Pardon me, I'm sorry.
Just real briefly, I think you're right. I mean, why not the face of the person next to them as well? In other words, maybe not. I would probably be reluctant to deny that. In other, oh no, they're not the face of Christ. But you need to be attentive to the fact that you can find Christ in anybody you're looking at if you just be attentive enough, right? And so maybe shifting the burden to have them take another look at you or somebody else or whatever the case might be. And I think similarly with regard to the cross, I mean, there's a sense in which then that the assumption is that, only people with disabilities are linked to the cross, but we're all linked to the cross. And again, finding a way to reorient the conversation so there's a recognition that people with disabilities are not any more specially linked to the cross than the person that you're talking to. Doing that in a pastorally appropriate way that keeps them within the fold and that keeps them giving to the church. It's important.
Question here?
Justin Hancock, United Methodist pastor, and my wife and I are developing an intentional community where the able-bodied and disabled can come together and live in mutual dependence off or with and for one another. And my question would be, while I see the value of ongoing discussions like this from the TAB or temporarily able-bodied perspective, what do you think the benefit of maybe changing the ethos of the discussion would be to where it comes more organically from the disabled perspective? Am I making sense? Because within the discussion, while I appreciate the value, it still seems to come from an outside-in perspective.
Appreciate that, yes. So important to register as many of the voices as possible. And I think part of the challenge is that in most of our religious communities, including many of our churches, it's these kinds of underlying theological assumptions that inhibit even the emergence of a community of people with different abilities to feel welcome, identify that as a home, and therefore register their voices, right? So that's an ongoing struggle, isn't it? And perhaps some religious communities are further along the conversation and in a better situation, better position to be able to really receive not just input but challenge from those able to provide it, and others maybe are a long ways from where that's at. So yeah, depending on where we're at, what kind of what our religious communities are, where the conversation is at, I think we'll be at different places on that. But I completely agree with you that at the end of the day, it's one of the goals ought to be getting us to the point where people with disabilities are driving the conversation. That's what I'm grasping for, or gesturing toward when I talk about ministry with people with disabilities, so that it's not just again something that they're on one end of.
There's a question over there. Yes?
Yes.
it's more of a comment and a sort of goes to what investors were saying, but I think one of the biggest issues is the fears of the temporarily able-bodied people. In my viewing, a lot of people cannot conceive how I could be perfectly okay with my disability only because they have such a fear of becoming like me or someone else, and they cannot handle the idea. So I think there's a lot of fear of temporarily able-bodied people.
Can I ask your personal assistant to help us get the point of the comment or question?
Yeah, it's basically a fear from the temporarily able-bodied people I see as one of the biggest issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I get it, but I would like you to repeat it for the audience, please.
Okay. So one of the biggest issues is the fear of the temporarily able-bodied people. She doesn't think that they can conceive becoming disabled and living a good life.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool.
Amos.
Yeah, normative presuppositions and assumptions are very difficult to overcome, you know, and I think that's why we continue to have these kinds of conversations, and just got to keep moving the ball down the field, as it were, to use another metaphor. Thank you very much.
Oops. Does this one work?
Thank you so much for your talk. In following on the question from Ann Masters, if we analyze the situation, I think the question of suffering is kind of the part of the byproduct of another conversation we had in the past century in terms of making Christ's suffering as kind of the bond between the divinity of God and the humanity of Christ, and kind of that mystery. And I think at some point that type of theological quest has backfired for people with disabilities, because although we tend to portray suffering as the bonding element between God and Christ and how Christ relates to us, and as I follow through your talk, suffering has been used in a different way for people with disabilities. In your mind, what has been the disconnect between envisioning suffering as something that connects us to Christ, but not being able to connect suffering as something that connects us to people with disability, in terms of that dichotomy of we see the topic relevant in one sphere, but we don't see it relevant in another sphere.
Thanks. Yeah, complicated set of issues here. I think part of the challenge is to connect back with the comment from here is that most of the time from a normate or tab perspective, suffering is not understood as a socially constructed reality. In other words, the reason why we suffer oftentimes is because, you know, we feel that, and this is again not even quite apart from the disability question. I mean, our suffering oftentimes is generated by our felt sense of failure, our felt sense of being isolated, ostracized for, again, reasons quite apart from the issue of disability. So suffering is in that sense very much a social phenomenon, right? I mean, how we live in and interact with the world around us. Now, so with regard to the experience of disability, well, then you've got a whole bunch of other normate kinds of assumptions that are in play that complicate it. I think the move to do it theologically there's two sides to it. And this, I think, this reflects the difficulty of the theological conversation as a whole. So on the one hand, you know, we could develop a kind of theology of the cross approach. I mean, so that the cross becomes the central way to define Christian life, Christian faith, Christian discipleship, and that's certainly there are lots of biblical resources for us to think with that. You know, what that means then with regard to suffering on the one hand, disability on the second hand, and just the human condition on the third hand, I think that there's a lot of work that could be done on that side. On the other side, and you know, I come from religious community, Christian communities, Pentecostal charismatic communities, for which we've been accused of having a theology of glory. Now, I mean, there is a message to the resurrection, and how do we understand that? And how do we understand the relationship to the cross? So that all gets very, very complicated, you know, in terms of how you parse where emphases fall in your theological system, the role of the cross, the role of the resurrection, the role of Pentecost after resurrection, how all that plays out. It seems to me that you know, we need to have these multiple theological resources, metaphors, points of entry into the conversation. Sometimes the cross perspective, I think, can be very, very helpful. Other times it can be very debilitating, depending on the particular situation, depending on how these resources are used in a particular context of pastoral care, right? Theologies of glory can be similarly also damaging, right? Because they're less attentive to the existential and the social, even other dimensions of suffering that people might be having to endure from a disability point of view. So I think my point would simply be to say that I think that's why we need to have an ongoing theological conversation, because there are multiple theological resources. They can all be just as helpful in certain contexts, but they can all be just as dangerous, perhaps, in other contexts, and not used appropriately or not used contextually in relationship to other theological aspects. So I think that's in part why we need to have these ongoing theological wrestling with the issues.
Thank you. There's a question over there, the back of the room.
I've read several of your books, and so I would like to start the conversation from suffering to salvation, because I feel like each person, disabled or non-disabled, is going to have their element of suffering, just because we're Christians and that's what we signed up for. My question is, in several of your books, I don't want to misquote you, so I'm going to paraphrase what I've read. You talk about perhaps the person with disabilities being judged differently than the person without disabilities. I don't know what I think about that concept, because I sin just as much as an able-bodied person as, if not.
I got that a couple of my books are controversial, and we need to have a talk over lunch, is what I got.
The point being, she taught people with, and that why should people with disabilities have just as much power and ability to sin as anybody
Bill,
else?
Bill, your microphone is still not working right. Could you change it? Thank you.
Okay, well, you can say.
Okay, let's try this again. Take two. I was curious as to why you mentioned in several of your books that people with disabilities would be judged differently than able-bodied individuals, because I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that, because I sinned more than an able-bodied person does, or vice versa. We've all been extended the same amount of grace and forgiveness, so I don't see why judging would be differently, or salvation would be viewed as differently. Okay. Anyway, can you elaborate?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around that too. But yeah, definitely let's connect over lunch. I think the only thing I would say is that I don't think that I argue or suggest that people with disabilities should be judged differently. I think what I've tried to suggest is that whatever we think the final judgment is, God is just in God's judgment. So therefore, God will judge everybody, people across the spectrum of abilities, justly. And what does that mean? Well, we can talk about the different ways in which that might happen. One potential question is, what does it mean? And again, depending on which theological tradition you come from, what does it mean? How do you understand the doctrine of the fall and original sin, and how it relates to people? How does it relate to people across the spectrum of abilities? What does it mean that people across the spectrum of disabilities can sin? What does sin mean? So there's going to be a lot of theological debate about how to understand sin. Sin as a condition, sin as a state of the soul, sin as particular actions that people do in certain theological traditions. So depending on which theological tradition one comes from, one might want to talk about sin regarding people with disabilities in some of those ways. And from my perspective, it seems to me that the mystery of sin is just as complicated as trying to talk about the mystery of salvation. I think that's part of where we're thinking about things, but thinking about these issues, particularly with regard to people with severe and profound intellectual disabilities, gets a little challenging. I'd want to think about sin not merely in terms of what we do, not merely in terms of what we think, which is how that might be defined mostly for able-bodied realities, temporally able-bodied realities. But what about sin as habit, sin as disposition, sin on the affective level? In other words, if we are going to look at who we are, this now gets into the whole realm of theological anthropology. What does it mean? What does it mean to be human? And how does our humanness work itself out along these various registers, the intellectual register, the moral, the affective, and so on. So it gets really complicated. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that too. So let's have lunch together.
There is a final room for one final question.
I can give you a very simple way out of the problem.
Oh,
both
praise
Heather
God.
and
Hallelujah.
Amos.
That's what we have conferences like this
and
for.
Since we're thinking pastorally, this came to me from a pastoral visitor in the hospital for a month. Point one was she knew me well enough to know that I had not sinned to earn what had happened. B, therefore, that meant that I had paid my penance. I had done it. I was through. C, and she said these words, you now have carte blanche to sin for the rest of your life. So, anybody here with a disability who has suffered is home free.
Yeah.
So, thank you. That's one way to read divine justice, right?
Yeah. Makes me as a Pentecostal want to become whatever you are.
Okay, yeah, sure. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Amos for this start this morning.